Rain hammered against the towering glass walls of St. Gabriel Medical Center, turning the city lights beyond the lobby into blurred rivers of gold and white. The polished marble floor reflected every fluorescent panel overhead, while the faint scent of disinfectant drifted through the cool evening air. Rubber wheels from hospital stretchers whispered across the floor, elevator bells chimed in measured intervals, and somewhere beyond the emergency doors, a child cried before the sound dissolved into silence. Amid the movement of expensive suits, crisp white lab coats, and hurried footsteps, one man guided a worn mop across the marble with quiet precision. No one noticed him. No one wondered why a janitor carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had once stood in rooms where life-changing decisions were made. And no one could have guessed what promise had forced a man like him into that gray uniform. Daniel Carter worked as though every polished tile deserved respect. His gray maintenance shirt was spotless despite hours of labor. The faded name patch stitched above his pocket had begun to fray, but his sleeves remained neatly rolled to identical lengths. Every movement was measured. Every bucket was returned to exactly the same position. Every caution sign faced precisely the direction visitors would first approach. People often mistook such habits for obsession. They were wrong. Discipline had simply become the only language grief still understood. As another group of surgeons hurried through the lobby discussing complicated procedures, Daniel quietly stepped aside before anyone needed to ask. One doctor passed within inches of him without making eye contact. Invisible. He had grown accustomed to the feeling years ago. His thoughts drifted, not toward the hospital around him, but toward the small apartment waiting across town. At this hour his 12-year-old son, Noah, would be making sure his younger sister Emily had finished her homework before bed. Dinner had already been prepared that morning before Daniel left for work, a simple chicken stew that could stretch for 2 meals. Their lives were modest. But they were together. That mattered more than comfort ever could. He smiled faintly as he remembered Emily insisting that morning that he attend her school art exhibition the following week. "You won't miss it this time, will you, Dad?" He never missed anything that mattered. Not anymore. The automatic entrance doors slid open with a rush of damp night air. A woman stepped cautiously inside. Her coat was soaked from the rain. Water dripped from dark strands of hair that clung to her pale face. Her shoes looked several sizes too large, worn almost completely through at the soles. She hugged her thin jacket tightly around herself despite the heated lobby. People noticed her immediately. Not because she was loud. Because she looked like someone the elegant building had forgotten how to welcome. Visitors instinctively looked away. Receptionists exchanged uncertain glances. Security watched from a distance. The woman hesitated beneath the bright lobby lights, blinking as though the warmth itself felt unfamiliar. Daniel quietly parked his cleaning cart. He walked toward her without hurry, without judgment. "Good evening," he said softly. She startled slightly before meeting his eyes. "They said?" Her voice trembled. "They said there might be somewhere warm." "There is." He pulled a chair away from the crowded waiting area. "Please." She lowered herself carefully, her hands shaking from cold more than fear. Daniel disappeared for less than a minute before returning with a paper cup of hot tea from the staff lounge and a neatly folded blanket borrowed from the volunteer services desk. He placed both beside her without ceremony. She stared at the steaming cup for several seconds. No one had offered her kindness in a very long time. Her fingers wrapped around the warmth as tears quietly gathered in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You don't need to apologize. I probably smell terrible. The rain smells stronger." For the first time that evening, she managed the smallest smile. "My name is Elena." "Daniel." Silence settled gently between them. Not uncomfortable. Peaceful. Outside, thunder rolled across the city skyline while droplets raced down the enormous glass windows. Finally, Elena looked toward the polished floor. "So many people here." Daniel nodded. "So many families." Another nod. Then her voice became almost too quiet to hear. "I have no family left." The words seemed to absorb every surrounding sound. Daniel felt something tighten inside his chest. Not pity. Recognition. He knew what empty chairs around a dinner table looked like. He knew what promises whispered beside a hospital bed could cost a person for the rest of their life. He did not ask her to explain. Some grief deserved permission before questions. Instead, he simply pulled another chair beside hers and sat down, still wearing his janitor's uniform, still holding the damp cleaning gloves he had forgotten to remove. "You don't have to sit alone tonight," he said. For several long seconds, Elena simply cried in silence. Around them, hospital life continued uninterrupted. Doctors hurried past. Visitors checked their phones. Executives crossed the marble floor discussing budgets. Almost no one noticed the janitor sitting beside a lonely stranger. Almost. At the far end of the lobby, a pair of polished black heels clicked sharply against the marble. Every conversation nearby seemed to soften. Employees instinctively straightened their posture. The hospital CEO had just entered. Victoria Langford's cold eyes settled on the unexpected scene. And they did not look pleased. The rhythm of polished heels echoed across the marble lobby with the certainty of authority. Every employee within sight instinctively adjusted their posture. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Even the soft hum of the reception desk seemed to retreat beneath the weight of expectation. Victoria Langford never needed to announce her arrival. Her presence did it for her. Tailored in a charcoal suit that fit with effortless precision, she moved through the lobby with the confidence of someone who believed every square foot of the hospital reflected her reputation. A silver identification badge rested neatly against her jacket, catching the overhead light as she approached. Behind her walked two vice presidents, the director of operations, and a pair of board donors touring the facility. Then she stopped. Her gaze settled on Daniel. More precisely, on the janitor sitting beside a homeless woman beneath the hospital's bright entrance lights. Her expression hardened. "What," she asked coolly, "is happening here?" The question cut through the lobby. Daniel rose calmly. "She needed somewhere warm." Victoria's eyes moved briefly to Elena before returning to Daniel. "This is not a shelter." "No," Daniel replied evenly. "It's a hospital." A few nearby nurses exchanged nervous glances. Victoria folded her arms. "And your job?" "Facilities." "Exactly." Her voice became louder, intentionally so. "You are paid to clean floors, not to entertain people who walk in off the street." The words carried farther than necessary. Visitors looked over. Doctors slowed their pace. Receptionists froze behind their desks. Daniel remained still. Elena lowered her head, clutching the paper cup as though it might disappear. Victoria stepped closer. "You've taken hospital property, occupied a public waiting area, and interrupted staff workflow." "I borrowed a blanket," Daniel answered quietly. "I'll return it." The CEO gave a short, humorless laugh. "You don't seem to understand your position." Daniel didn't respond. Silence often revealed more than argument. Victoria mistook that silence for submission. She turned toward the executives accompanying her. "This," she said with a polished smile, "is exactly why organizations decline when employees forget their place. Compassion without policy becomes chaos." Several people nodded politely. Others looked uncomfortable. One elderly volunteer glanced toward Elena with visible sadness but remained silent. Victoria faced Daniel again. "If everyone brought strangers inside because they felt emotional, we'd have a lobby full of homeless people instead of patients." The sentence landed heavily. Elena's shoulders trembled. Daniel noticed. He gently placed the folded blanket over her shoulders without saying a word. The gesture lasted only seconds. Yet somehow it felt louder than every sentence Victoria had spoken. For the first time, the lobby became completely still. The silence settled over polished marble, fluorescent light, and expensive leather shoes. No one interrupted it. Victoria's jaw tightened. "Security." Two uniformed officers approached from the entrance. "Escort this woman outside." Elena's frightened eyes widened. I'll leave." She struggled to stand. Daniel offered his hand. She hesitated before accepting it. His grip was steady. Not forceful. Simply reassuring. As she stood, Daniel quietly removed his own rain jacket and placed it around her shoulders. It was old. The elbows were worn. The zipper no longer closed properly. But it was dry. Victoria watched with open disbelief. "You've just given away part of your uniform. I can work without a jacket. And if you're sick tomorrow?" He answered without hesitation. "Then I'll recover." Several employees looked down. Something about his answer made the lobby feel smaller. Less certain. Victoria refused to let the moment linger. "I've seen enough." She turned toward the operations director. "I want a formal report. Unauthorized use of hospital resources. Failure to follow protocol. Conduct unbecoming of an employee." Daniel simply nodded. "If that's your decision." She seemed irritated by his composure. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" He looked briefly toward Elena before answering. "Only this." His voice never rose. "A building becomes a hospital because people inside choose compassion. Otherwise, it's only concrete, machines, and expensive furniture." Nobody moved. The room seemed to forget how to breathe. One young resident physician slowly lowered the patient file in his hands. A nurse near the elevators wiped unexpected tears from her eyes. Even one of the board donors looked thoughtfully toward Elena. Victoria sensed the shift immediately. She smiled. But there was no warmth in it. Very poetic. She stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "But poetry doesn't run hospitals." Daniel met her gaze without challenge. "No. It doesn't. People do." Another silence. Heavier this time. Victoria broke eye contact first. "Get back to work." Daniel nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." He helped Elena toward the entrance, stopping only long enough to speak softly. "Across the street there's a community outreach center. They'll still be open." She looked at him through tear-filled eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Daniel thought for a moment. Then he smiled, a tired smile shaped by years of quiet loss. "Because once, someone stayed beside my family when they didn't have to." Elena whispered. "Thank you." She disappeared into the rain, wrapped in the jacket of a man who owned very little yet had somehow given away the warmest thing he had. Daniel watched until she was safely across the street. Only then did he return. Without complaint. Without resentment. He picked up his mop exactly where he had left it. The marble still needed cleaning. The work still mattered. As he pushed the mop forward, he noticed something unusual. Several hospital employees who had ignored him for years now looked at him differently. Not with admiration. Not yet. With curiosity. As if they had just realized they had been walking past someone they had never truly seen. Far above the lobby, Victoria stood behind the glass wall of her executive office. She watched Daniel through the rain-streaked windows below. Something about him disturbed her. A janitor should have been embarrassed. Angry. Broken. Instead, he had remained calm. People remembered calm. And people who remembered could become dangerous. She reached for the phone on her desk. "I want everything we have on Daniel Carter," she said. "Employment history. Background checks. Previous employers. I don't care how long it takes." There was a pause. Then she added quietly, "Something about him doesn't fit." Far below, Daniel dipped the mop into clean water. His reflection shimmered across the polished marble before disappearing beneath another careful stroke. He had no idea that the quiet kindness he had shown one stranger had just begun unraveling a secret powerful enough to change every life inside St. Gabriel Medical Center. Cold air drifted through the intensive care wing before sunrise, carrying the sharp scent of antiseptic, warm electrical equipment, and freshly brewed coffee from the nurse's station. Fluorescent lights reflected across spotless vinyl floors while cardiac monitors produced their steady rhythm like tiny mechanical heartbeats. Beyond thick glass walls, exhausted physicians reviewed charts beneath pale blue computer screens, unaware that within minutes the hospital's carefully controlled order would begin collapsing around them. Daniel Carter pushed his cleaning cart through the fourth-floor corridor with the same quiet precision that had marked every shift for the past 3 years. The events of the previous evening had already become whispered conversation. Some employees looked away when he passed. Others offered small, uncertain nods. A young nurse quietly said, "Good morning, Daniel." It was the first time she had ever used his name. He smiled gently. "Morning." He expected nothing more. Recognition had never been the reason he came to work. As he emptied a waste bin outside the surgical command center, a sudden electronic chime echoed through the hallway. Then another. Then 5 more. Within seconds, every computer monitor inside the department flashed black. The overhead lighting flickered once. Twice. Emergency backup power activated with a heavy metallic click. The calm atmosphere shattered. "What happened?" "I've lost patient records. The imaging server is offline." Phones began ringing simultaneously. Doctors hurried between stations, tapping keyboards that refused to respond. Digital medication schedules disappeared. Radiology images vanished from screens. A scheduled transplant operation, already preparing to begin, was suddenly without access to critical laboratory results. The corridor transformed into controlled panic. Daniel stopped pushing his cart. His eyes instinctively lifted toward the emergency status panel mounted above the hallway. One small amber indicator blinked in a pattern almost no one else noticed. 3 short flashes. Pause. 3 more. His expression changed. Only slightly. He had seen that sequence before. Years ago. Far away from janitorial work. Inside another life. A senior systems engineer rushed past him carrying 2 laptops. "We've completely lost the network." "No," Daniel said quietly. The engineer barely heard him. Daniel looked once more toward the status display. "It isn't the network." The engineer stopped. "What?" "The network is protecting itself." Several nearby staff members looked toward the janitor with puzzled expressions. Daniel stepped closer to the display. "Server cluster B failed first." The engineer frowned. "How would you know that?" Daniel pointed toward the blinking indicator. "Because only cluster B triggers that fault sequence." Silence. The engineer stared. "That code isn't even listed on the public maintenance manual." Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched another warning light appear. His voice remained calm. "You have 6 minutes before the backup authentication server reaches overload." One of the IT technicians laughed nervously. "That's impossible." Daniel met his eyes. "Look at your processor temperature." The technician opened a diagnostic tablet. His face drained of color. "It's climbing." Another alarm sounded. Louder this time. Inside the operating theater, surgeons preparing for the transplant received notification that digital imaging remained unavailable. A nurse rushed into the corridor. "We can't delay much longer." The engineer turned back toward Daniel. "How do you know this system?" Daniel hesitated. For a brief moment, memories returned with uncomfortable clarity. Conference rooms. Architectural blueprints. Emergency simulations. His late wife smiling proudly from the audience as he accepted an innovation award he had never cared about. He quietly pushed the memories away. "There isn't time to explain." He stepped toward the wall-mounted emergency terminal. "It's trying to reroute through an inactive mirror server." The IT technician shook his head. "That server was retired." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "It wasn't retired. It was isolated." The technician blinked. "How could you possibly know that?" Daniel ignored the question. Instead, he spoke with calm authority. "Open manual override. We don't have authorization. You do if patient safety is compromised." The engineer hesitated only a second before entering emergency credentials. "Access denied?" Daniel wasn't surprised. The authorization tree changed. He reached toward the keyboard. Then stopped. His hands hovered in the air. He looked down at the faded gray sleeves of his janitor's uniform. He knew exactly what would happen if he crossed this line. Everything he had worked so hard to leave behind would begin following him again. Across the corridor, a child's frightened cry echoed from a treatment room. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Then he made his decision. He stepped to the keyboard. His fingers moved across the keys with astonishing speed. Not randomly. Deliberately. Confidently. The surrounding staff fell completely silent. Even the alarms seemed distant beneath the sharp rhythm of keystrokes. Within seconds, dormant diagnostic windows appeared on every monitor. The engineer whispered almost to himself. No one knows that interface. Daniel never looked up. Now redirect authentication through Mirror Node 7. There isn't a Mirror 7. There is. The engineer swallowed. How do you know? Daniel pressed one final command. Every monitor throughout the corridor suddenly came back to life. Patient records reappeared. Medical imaging returned. The operating room erupted with relieved voices. Critical systems stabilized. The alarm stopped. An almost impossible silence settled over the hallway. Dozens of doctors, nurses, technicians, and administrators stood frozen, staring not at the computers, but at the janitor standing quietly beside them. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The silence lingered with an almost physical weight. It pressed against the fluorescent-lit corridor, settling over polished floors and stainless steel equipment. The relentless chorus of alarms had vanished, replaced by the soft hum of restored servers and the steady rhythm of heart monitors from nearby patient rooms. No one moved. No one seemed willing to be the first to speak. Daniel slowly removed his hands from the keyboard. His breathing remained even. There was no smile of satisfaction, no expectation of applause. He simply glanced at the diagnostic display one final time, ensuring every system had stabilized. Patient records are synchronized, he said quietly. Radiology should verify image integrity, and pharmacy needs to confirm medication timestamps before dispensing. The senior IT engineer stared at him. That's exactly our emergency recovery protocol. Daniel nodded once. It should be. The engineer blinked. What do you mean it should be? Daniel looked toward the operating suite. The transplant team has already lost enough time. Without another word, he stepped away from the terminal and reached for the handle of his cleaning cart. The simple gesture felt almost surreal. A man who had just restored the hospital's digital backbone was preparing to mop another hallway. The contrast unsettled everyone watching. Inside the operating room, the lead surgeon's voice echoed through the reopened communications system. Records confirmed. Imaging restored. We're proceeding. A collective breath swept through the corridor. Lives had been spared. Not because of a celebrated executive. Not because of an expensive consultant. Because of the janitor everyone had overlooked. The silence broke at last. Daniel! The voice belonged to the young nurse who had greeted him earlier. She looked at him with open disbelief. Who are you? Daniel paused. For a heartbeat, grief flickered behind his eyes. Then it disappeared beneath the same quiet composure he carried every day. I'm exactly who my badge says I am. He resumed, pushing the cleaning cart. Its wheels squeaked softly across the polished floor. No one stopped him. No one knew how. Several floors above, Victoria Langford stood before the glass wall of her executive office, her expression tightening as the operations director hurried inside. The outage is over, he reported, still catching his breath. I know. Victoria never looked away from the city skyline. IT restored it? The director hesitated. Not exactly. Now she turned. What does that mean? The director swallowed. The janitor. What janitor? Daniel Carter. Silence. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Explain. He identified the failure before our engineers did. Impossible. He accessed diagnostic systems no one thought he knew existed. That's impossible. He restored the network in less than 4 minutes. Victoria's face remained perfectly composed. Only the tightening of her jaw betrayed her thoughts. Who authorized him? No one. And IT simply allowed it? They didn't have another option. Victoria walked slowly toward her desk. The polished wood reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the windows. She rested both hands against its edge. You said yesterday he was giving blankets to strangers. Yes. Today he's rebuilding hospital infrastructure. Yes. She stared into space for several long seconds. Something didn't fit. People like Daniel Carter did not exist. Not in her world. A janitor could be hardworking, kind, reliable. But he could not possess knowledge reserved for elite specialists. Unless he was hiding something. She pressed a button on her desk phone. Human Resources. A voice answered immediately. I want Daniel Carter's complete personnel file. There was a brief pause. And contact corporate compliance. Another pause. Also legal. The director frowned. You think he did something wrong? I think, Victoria replied calmly, that no one accidentally becomes indispensable. She closed the folder in front of her. People who hide extraordinary abilities usually hide extraordinary secrets. Back downstairs, Daniel had already returned to work. The smell of floor polish mixed with the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the cafeteria. He dipped the mop into clean water. Back. Forward. Back. Forward. The familiar rhythm steadied his thoughts. He knew exactly what had happened upstairs. He had crossed the line he had promised himself never to cross again. His hidden past had reached into the present. And once that happened, it rarely stopped. As he rounded the corner near the pediatric wing, his phone vibrated inside his pocket. A text message from Noah. Emily won first place in art today. She keeps asking if you'll make it home for dinner tonight. Daniel smiled. The tension in his shoulders eased. He typed only 3 words. I wouldn't miss it. He slipped the phone away and continued mopping. For him, that message mattered far more than the whispers now spreading through the hospital. But somewhere above him, behind glass offices and polished boardroom doors, an investigation had already begun. And Victoria Langford had made a private decision. She would uncover Daniel Carter's past. Even if she had to destroy his future to do it. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the hospital's executive corridor, casting long rectangles of pale gold across the polished stone floor. The air carried the faint aroma of roasted coffee and fresh printer ink, while the distant hum of elevators blended with the quiet conversations of administrators arriving for another day of carefully scheduled decisions. Everything appeared orderly. Everything appeared controlled. Yet beneath that polished surface, suspicion had already begun spreading faster than any system failure. Daniel Carter was halfway through polishing the brass handrail outside the executive offices when a young administrative assistant approached him. Her expression was uneasy. Mr. Carter? Daniel looked up. Yes? The Human Resources Department would like to see you. He smiled politely. I assumed they might. The assistant hesitated. They asked that you come immediately. Daniel placed the polishing cloth neatly inside his cart. He straightened the sleeves of his faded gray uniform before quietly following her down the corridor. Each step echoed against the marble. Employees glanced up from their desks. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched openly. News of yesterday's events had already traveled throughout the hospital. The janitor who had restored the hospital's entire digital infrastructure had become the subject of whispered conversations in every department. Daniel ignored them all. He had learned years ago that rumors burned hottest before the truth arrived. The Human Resources conference room felt unusually cold. Bright LED panels illuminated a long walnut table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. A pitcher of untouched water rested beside neatly arranged folders. Victoria Langford sat at the head of the table. Beside her were the hospital's legal counsel, the director of human resources, the chief compliance officer, and 2 security supervisors. Daniel counted 6 people. Far more than necessary for an ordinary meeting. He quietly took the empty chair opposite them. Victoria folded her hands. Mr. Carter. Ms. Langford. I'd like to discuss yesterday's incident. Daniel nodded once. I expected that. Good. Her voice remained calm. Let's begin with something simple. She opened a personnel file. You've been employed here for 3 years. Yes. Before that, you worked maintenance at 2 schools. Correct. Before that. She paused. There's almost nothing. The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel remained composed. I took time away from work. Victoria's eyes never left him. For nearly 7 years? Yes. What were you doing? He answered truthfully. Raising my children. The HR director glanced down at the file. There are significant gaps. There are. Victoria leaned forward. Yesterday you accessed restricted diagnostic systems unavailable to almost every employee in this hospital. Daniel didn't deny it. You entered commands our senior engineers had never seen. Yes. You identified infrastructure no longer documented. Yes. She closed the folder. So I'll ask again. Who are you? Daniel considered the question. Finally, he answered quietly. I'm a father. Victoria sighed. That wasn't my question. It was the important answer. For the first time, irritation flashed across her face. You expect this committee to believe a janitor just happens to possess advanced systems knowledge? No. Then explain it. Daniel looked around the room. His eyes briefly rested on the framed mission statement hanging beside the hospital logo. Compassion before prestige. A sad smile crossed his face. The explanation isn't relevant. Victoria's tone sharpened. It became relevant the moment you interfered with hospital operations. I prevented patients from being harmed. Without authorization. Yes. That's called misconduct. Daniel met her eyes. No. It's called responsibility. The room fell silent. Not hostile. Uncertain. Even the legal counsel shifted uncomfortably. Victoria pressed a button on the conference table. The security camera footage from yesterday's outage appeared on a large display screen. Everyone watched. Daniel entered the frame. Moments later, the entire network recovered. Victoria paused the recording. There. She pointed toward the frozen image. You accessed protected systems. I did. Do you admit violating security policy? I admit protecting patients. She stood. You continue refusing to answer the central question. Daniel remained seated. Some answers belong to the past. Not when they affect my hospital. A knock interrupted the meeting. An IT engineer entered carrying a thick binder. I'm sorry to interrupt. Victoria gestured impatiently. What is it? We completed the forensic review. And? The engineer looked directly at Daniel before speaking. Everything he did was technically correct. Victoria frowned. So? He didn't damage anything. I know that. He actually restored several emergency redundancies that had been failing silently for months. The room grew still again. The engineer swallowed. If Mr. Carter hadn't intervened. He hesitated. We might have lost patience. No one spoke. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the quiet hum of the projector. Victoria slowly closed the binder. Her expression had become unreadable. Then, in a voice so calm it felt dangerous, she said, Leave us. The engineer obeyed. As the door closed behind him, Victoria looked back at Daniel. Her smile returned. But there was no kindness in it. If I can't prove you incompetent, she said softly, I'll simply prove you don't belong here. The meeting was no longer about policy. It had become personal. The conference room door closed with a muted click, leaving behind a silence that felt colder than the air conditioning humming through the ceiling vents. Morning light stretched across the walnut table, illuminating the untouched glasses of water and the thick personnel file that now lay open like an accusation. Victoria Langford rested both palms on the table. Mr. Carter, she said evenly. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an internal investigation. The words were delivered with practiced professionalism. But everyone in the room understood their purpose. This was not procedure. It was punishment. Daniel slowly rose from his chair. I understand. The Human Resources Director shifted uncomfortably. Your employee badge, please. Without hesitation, Daniel unclipped the faded identification card from his uniform and placed it gently on the table. The plastic badge made only the faintest sound as it touched the polished wood. 3 years of faithful work. Reduced to a whisper. One of the security supervisors stepped forward. We'll escort you to collect your belongings. Daniel nodded. That won't be necessary. I'm not leaving angry. For the first time since the meeting began, the older security officer looked directly into Daniel's eyes. There was sympathy there. Not authority. As Daniel walked through the executive corridor, employees stopped pretending not to notice. Conversations faded. Computer keyboards fell silent. The janitor who had saved the hospital's systems was now leaving under investigation. No one understood how both things could be true. Daniel reached his maintenance closet. Inside, everything remained exactly where he had left it. His mop stood against the wall. Cleaning supplies were arranged with quiet precision. A lunchbox sat on the shelf beside a small framed photograph. He picked it up. It showed him years earlier with his wife, Sarah, standing between Noah and a much younger Emily. They were laughing at something beyond the camera, sunlight warming their faces. Daniel traced the edge of the frame with his thumb. I kept my promise, he whispered. I stayed with them. He placed the photograph carefully into his bag. Nothing else in the closet truly belonged to him. That evening, rain fell softly over the apartment windows. The smell of vegetable soup filled the small kitchen as Noah stirred a pot while Emily sat at the table, coloring another picture for school. The front door opened. Dad! Emily ran into Daniel's arms before noticing the folded uniform under his arm. You came home early. He smiled. I did. Noah studied his father's face. You lost your job. It wasn't a question. Daniel sighed gently. For now. Emily looked confused. But you didn't do anything wrong. Daniel knelt beside her. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't immediately look like winning. She frowned. That's not fair. No, he admitted softly. It isn't. There was a quiet knock at the apartment door. Noah opened it cautiously. Standing in the hallway was Elena. She looked different now. Cleaner clothes. Healthier. Still carrying the kindness Daniel had shown her in the hospital lobby. I hope I'm not interrupting. Daniel smiled warmly. Not at all. She stepped inside, holding a folder close to her chest. I've been volunteering at the outreach center. I'm glad. They helped me. She hesitated. And while I was there, I met someone. Daniel's expression changed. Someone who knew you. He remained silent. Elena slowly opened the folder. Inside were newspaper articles, photographs, and an old magazine cover. Every page showed the same man. Younger. Wearing a tailored suit instead of a janitor's uniform. Standing beside advanced medical technology. Receiving national awards. Delivering keynote speeches. The headline on one article read, Healthcare Systems Visionary Daniel Carter Announces Unexpected Resignation. Emily looked from the photographs to her father. Dad? Noah stared in disbelief. You built hospitals? Daniel lowered his eyes. A long time ago. Why didn't you tell us? He looked toward the framed photograph of Sarah resting on the bookshelf. Because after your mother died, none of those titles mattered. His voice remained calm, but grief quietly returned to it. I could spend my life chasing promotions. Or I could raise the two people she trusted me with most. A tear rolled down Elena's cheek. You gave up everything. Daniel shook his head. No. I chose everything. The apartment fell silent. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, two children looked at their father with entirely new eyes. For years they had believed he was simply a hard-working janitor. Now they were beginning to understand the extraordinary man who had quietly sacrificed prestige so they would never have to grow up without a parent. But across the city, Victoria Langford had received the same file. She now knew exactly who Daniel Carter had once been. And instead of ending her campaign against him, she decided to finish it before the truth could reach the hospital's board. The battle had become far larger than a job. It was now a fight for Daniel's name, his children's future, and the dignity he had protected through years of deliberate silence. Ms. Langford. The room quieted. I believe there are additional witnesses. The auditorium doors opened. 3 distinguished guests entered. The first was the president of a nationally respected healthcare technology foundation. The second was a retired hospital commissioner. The third was the former chairman of Medicis Integrated Health Solutions, the organization Daniel had left 7 years earlier. Murmurs spread across the audience. Victoria's confidence flickered. The former chairman approached the board. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify several facts. He placed a thick binder on the table. Mr. Daniel Carter did not unlawfully access this hospital's emergency infrastructure. He paused. He designed its original architecture. The room fell utterly silent. The words settled like stones. Several board members looked toward Daniel in disbelief. The chairman continued. Before resigning to care for his family, Mr. Carter led the National Emergency Integration Project adopted by dozens of hospitals across the country. He opened the binder. Every page contained engineering signatures, patent filings, system blueprints, and government certifications. Each carried Daniel Carter's name. The board members examined the documents carefully. One leaned toward the microphone. Are these authentic? They have already been independently verified. Victoria stepped forward. This changes nothing. Her voice sounded firmer than she felt. He concealed his identity. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm. I never lied. I simply never introduced myself by my past. The retired commissioner nodded. He accepted an entry-level maintenance position because he declined executive offers after his wife's death. Another board member looked up. Why? Daniel turned briefly toward Noah and Emily. So my children would never wonder where their father was. No one spoke. The silence was deeper than applause could ever have been. The chairman looked toward Victoria. Did you investigate Mr. Carter's explanation before suspending him? Victoria hesitated. I acted according to available information. The chief compliance officer slowly stood. I'm afraid that's inaccurate. Every eye turned toward him. He placed another folder before the board. Our independent review found that Ms. Langford instructed Human Resources to withhold exculpatory reports, ignored IT recommendations, and pursued disciplinary action despite written confirmation that Mr. Carter's intervention prevented a critical failure. The room erupted into stunned whispers. Victoria's composure finally cracked. Those reports were preliminary. They were final, the compliance officer replied. And they were signed before the suspension meeting. The chairman's expression hardened. This board cannot ignore intentional misconduct. A formal vote was called. Within minutes, the decision was unanimous. Victoria Langford was removed as chief executive officer, pending further legal and ethical review. She looked across the auditorium toward Daniel. I built this hospital. Daniel met her gaze without bitterness. No, he answered quietly. You managed it. The people inside it built it. She lowered her eyes. For the first time in years, there was nothing left for power to protect. The meeting concluded, but few people stood. Instead, one nurse began applauding. Then another. Soon the entire auditorium rose to its feet. The applause was not loud. It was sincere. Daniel accepted it with a small nod, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. The board chairman approached him. Mr. Carter, we'd like to offer you the position of Executive Director of Strategic Innovation. The room waited. Daniel smiled politely. I'm honored. But I'd like to decline. The chairman blinked. May I ask why? Daniel looked toward his children. Because executive meetings usually begin before sunrise and end after dinner. Soft laughter rippled through the audience. My children still need their father more than this hospital needs another executive. The chairman smiled. What if the position were redesigned around that priority? Daniel considered the question. Then I'd be happy to serve as an advisor. The chairman extended his hand. We'd be fortunate to have you. Daniel accepted. Later that afternoon, Elena stood in the hospital's restored community outreach office, where she had officially been hired to coordinate patient family support services. You changed my life, she said. Daniel shook his head gently. No. You found the strength to rebuild it. Emily slipped her small hand into Elena's. Dad says families can grow. Elena smiled through tears. I think he's right. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Daniel walked out of St. Gabriel Medical Center with Noah and Emily beside him. No cameras followed. No reporters waited. His greatest victory was not reclaiming a forgotten reputation. It was walking home with the two children for whom he had willingly surrendered everything the world admired. The evening breeze carried the scent of rain-soaked pavement, and golden light reflected across the sidewalks as the three disappeared into the rhythm of ordinary life. Some men spend their lives chasing recognition. Others quietly become the kind of people recognition eventually has no choice but to find. In the end, dignity does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who remains faithful to truth, love, and responsibility long after the applause has faded. Morning sunlight poured through the towering glass windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center's main auditorium, illuminating rows of polished oak seats where physicians, nurses, executives, donors, and board members gathered beneath the quiet hum of ceiling lights. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with expensive perfume and crisp paper as whispered conversations filled the room. At the front stood a long mahogany table bearing the hospital's seal. It was the very place where reputations would be decided. And it was the same audience that had witnessed Daniel Carter's public humiliation only days before. Victoria Langford stood confidently at the podium. She wore the same composed smile that had helped build her reputation. Ladies and gentlemen, she began. Today we conclude an internal investigation regarding serious breaches of hospital security and employee conduct. Across the room, Daniel entered quietly. He wore a simple navy suit instead of his janitor's uniform. It was the first time most employees had ever seen him dressed that way. He carried no briefcase. No stack of documents. Only a small leather folder. Noah and Emily sat together in the back row beside Elena. The children watched their father with anxious eyes, while Elena offered them a reassuring smile. Victoria noticed Daniel's arrival but continued speaking. Our responsibility is to protect this institution from individuals who exceed their authority, regardless of their intentions. Before she could continue, the chairman of the hospital board raised a hand.